Berlin, winter evening, mid-1930s. A boy stands at the edge of a crowd. He is too young to understand politics, but old enough to recognize power when he sees it. The streetlights flicker against polished leather boots. A line of men turns the corner, silent, synchronized, impossibly precise. They do not shout. They do not smile. They move like a single organism. And at the center of the formation walks one man in black. The coat fits perfectly. The fabric absorbs the light. Silver flashes at the collar. A skull stares from his cap. He does not raise his voice. He does not need to. The crowd parts before he reaches them. The boy will remember that image long after he forgets the speech that followed. Years later, survivors of the war would describe something unsettling. They did not first remember the words. They remembered the uniforms, the cut of the jacket, the shine of the boots. The way black fabric made a body look taller, sharper, untouchable. It is an uncomfortable truth. Evil rarely presents itself as chaos. More often, it arrives dressed for ceremony. In photographs from the 1930s, the men of the Schutzstaffel do not look like criminals. They look immaculate, tailored, composed, modern. That was not accidental. Someone chose that color. Someone approved that silhouette. Someone stitched those seams. Before the camps had names that would scar history, before Auschwitz, before Treblinka, there was an image being constructed. A visual language of authority. A costume for a new kind of state. And people bought it. Not just metaphorically. Factories ran. Contracts were signed. Designers sketched. Industrialists calculated margins. Clothing moved from cutting tables to rallies to offices to occupied territories. The transformation of a political movement into a regime did not happen only through speeches or laws. It happened through symbols, through repetition, through appearance. The black uniform did something remarkable. It made ideology look inevitable. When thousands wear the same cut, the same color, the same insignia, doubt disappears into symmetry. Individual conscience dissolves into formation. The uniform promises belonging to the wearer and obedience to everyone else. The question is not whether clothing caused history. The question is why so many were willing to dress it. How did fashion houses, textile factories, and respected manufacturers become suppliers to one of the most destructive systems of the 20th century? Were they believers, opportunists, survivors, collaborators? And what happens to a brand when the regime it clothed becomes synonymous with genocide? This is not a story about fabric alone. It is about image, about business, about aesthetics harnessed to ideology. Because before power is enforced, it is displayed. And in 1930s Germany, power chose to wear black. Before the SS became a state within a state, it became a visual experiment. In the early 1930s, the organization was still small compared to the SA. The brown shirts dominated the streets. They were loud, numerous, chaotic. Their uniforms were practical, almost improvised, a legacy of surplus colonial stock purchased cheaply after World War I. Himmler despised that aesthetic. He wanted something controlled, selective, ritualized. According to SS internal correspondence from 1932 to 1933, the leadership discussed the need for a uniform that would reflect the elite nature of the organization. This was not just about differentiation. It was about hierarchy. Karl Diebitsch began working on prototypes in the early 1930s after joining the SS, trained at the Academy of Fine Arts in Munich and experienced in decorative design. He approached the project with symbolic intention. Surviving sketches show variations in collar height, lapel angle, belt placement. The waist was deliberately tightened to create a V-shaped torso, a classic visual cue for authority and dominance. The trousers were cut to allow riding boots, reinforcing aristocratic and cavalry traditions. Diebitsch did not invent military tailoring. He reinterpreted it. The black color choice was strategic. Black dye was not uncommon in European formal wear, but using it for a paramilitary uniform was unusual. Black absorbs light, flattening detail while sharpening silhouette. In large formations, it creates visual unity. Individual facial expressions disappear. Outlines dominate. Psychologically, black carries associations of power, formality, death, and control. The SS leadership understood that. Walter Heck's contribution was equally deliberate. The twin lightning bolt runes were not ancient symbols discovered in archives. They were modern graphic work. Heck reportedly received a modest payment for the design, 2.50 Reichsmarks, a trivial sum for a symbol that would become globally infamous. The typography was angular, geometric, compatible with the regime's broader aesthetic language. The skull insignia had precedent. The Totenkopf had appeared in Prussian cavalry units in the 18th and 19th centuries. Himmler revived it intentionally, linking the SS to what he framed as a long German warrior tradition. In SS publications, this historical continuity was emphasized repeatedly. The uniform was therefore layered. Modern cut, historic references, minimalist symbolism, strict color discipline. It fused past myth with contemporary design. By 1933, as the Nazis consolidated control, tailors and manufacturers were instructed to standardize production. Measurements were regulated. Insignia placement was specified down to millimeters. Rank distinctions were codified through collar tabs and sleeve markings. The uniform became a portable hierarchy. It also became selective. Membership in the SS required proof of Aryan ancestry, often traced back to 1750 for officers. Photographs of candidates were reviewed. Posture, grooming, and physical presentation mattered. The uniform was not meant for the masses. It was a badge of admission into a curated elite. In contrast to the SA's mass mobilization aesthetic, the SS cultivated exclusivity. This difference became politically crucial in 1934, during the Night of the Long Knives. When Hitler eliminated the SA leadership, the SS emerged as the disciplined alternative. The visual distinction reinforced the political shift. Brown receded. Black advanced. The design process did not stop at fabric. It extended into choreography. At Nuremberg rallies, formations were rehearsed with precision. Lines were aligned to architectural axes, designed by Albert Speer. The black uniforms created stark geometric blocks against illuminated backdrops. Photographs from the period show how the dark figures contrasted dramatically with white searchlight beams. The regime understood optics. Uniform design aligned with broader Nazi aesthetics: symmetry, order, monumentalism. Even interior spaces of SS offices echoed the same principles: stripped decoration, hard lines, disciplined arrangement. Clothing was one component of an integrated visual system, and that system had practical implications. When the SS began administering concentration camps, its personnel were immediately recognizable. The black uniform established authority without explanation. Victims did not need to know names or ranks. The silhouette was enough. The uniform also insulated the wearer psychologically. Modern studies on de-individuation suggest that standardized clothing reduces personal accountability. While the SS could not have articulated that in academic terms, they exploited the effect intuitively. The man in uniform was not an individual. He was an instrument. By the late 1930s, as the Waffen-SS adopted field-gray combat uniforms closer to Wehrmacht standards, the black service uniform remained the ceremonial and symbolic core. It was worn at parades, official events, and public displays. It represented the idealized SS identity, even as the organization expanded into policing, intelligence, and genocide. Design had done its work. The SS did not merely equip itself, it branded itself. And in doing so, it demonstrated a modern lesson. Authoritarian power does not rely solely on force. It relies on aesthetics, on repetition, on the careful construction of legitimacy through appearance. The black uniform was not an accessory to power. It was part of its architecture. While designers refined symbols in studios and SS officials calibrated hierarchy in Berlin, another transformation was unfolding far from the rally grounds, in a small town called Metzingen. There, in 1924, a former soldier named Hugo Ferdinand Boss founded a modest clothing company. It was not glamorous. It produced workwear, raincoats, uniforms for postal workers and railway staff. Like many German businesses in the late 1920s, it struggled. The Weimar economy staggered through inflation, political instability, and finally the global crash of 1929. By 1931, survival required alignment. That same year, Hugo Boss joined the Nazi Party. His membership number placed him among early supporters in the region. Soon after, his factory began receiving contracts to produce uniforms for party organizations, first for the SA, later for the SS, Hitler Youth, and other formations tied to the regime. The relationship was not ideological poetry. It was logistical precision. Government contracts meant stability, predictable demand, access to raw materials that were increasingly regulated under state economic planning. By the mid-1930s, as Germany rearmed and standardized visual identity across its institutions, uniform manufacturing became a growth sector. The black SS service uniform, originally designed under the supervision of figures like Karl Diebitsch, required mass production. Design sketches were one thing. Supplying thousands of garments in standardized cuts, with regulated insignia placement and consistent dye quality, was another. That is where factories like Hugo Boss's entered the picture. Archival records indicate that by the late 1930s, the company had expanded significantly. Production lines were reorganized to meet large-scale orders. Machinery multiplied. Employment grew. By the early 1940s, the workforce exceeded 300 employees. But expansion came at a cost. As the war intensified and German labor was redirected to the front, factories across the Reich faced shortages. The solution, implemented widely across industries, was forced labor. From 1940 onward, Hugo Boss's factory employed foreign forced laborers, primarily women from Poland and later from France and other occupied territories. Historical research suggests that at least 140 forced laborers worked at the plant during the war years. They lived under supervision. Movement was restricted. Conditions were controlled by wartime regulations. The uniforms produced in Metzingen did not only clothe parade formations. As the war escalated, production included field gray military garments for the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS. The aesthetic may have shifted from ceremonial black to battlefield practicality, but the scale only increased. The transformation of Hugo Boss's business illustrates a broader pattern in Nazi Germany. Private industry did not dissolve under dictatorship. It adapted, it integrated, it benefited. Uniform production was profitable. Under the regime's economic policies, businesses that aligned with state priorities gained access to contracts, materials, and protection. Those who resisted faced marginalization or worse. The boundaries between coercion and opportunity were often blurred, but participation was real. After 1945, when Allied forces dismantled the Nazi state, industrial collaboration came under scrutiny. During the denazification process, Hugo Boss was classified not as a major offender, but as a follower, Mitläufer. He was fined and temporarily barred from running his company. The penalties were financial and administrative, not criminal. He died in 1948. The company survived. In the decades that followed, Hugo Boss repositioned itself. By the 1950s and 1960s, it shifted toward men's suits and high-quality tailoring. By the late 20th century, it had become a global luxury brand, associated with sleek modernity rather than paramilitary past. Yet, history does not dissolve as easily as fabric and dye. In the 1990s and early 2000s, as public research into corporate roles during the Third Reich intensified, Hugo Boss acknowledged its use of forced labor during the war. In 2011, the company issued a formal statement expressing profound regret for its involvement and participation in the German Foundation, Remembrance, Responsibility, and Future, which provided compensation to former forced laborers. The record is not ambiguous. The company did not design the SS uniform, but it produced uniforms for the Nazi regime and used forced labor in doing so. That distinction matters, but it does not erase participation. The factory in Metzingen was not an ideological think tank. It was a business responding to incentives and pressures inside a totalitarian economy. But the uniforms that left its cutting tables entered a system of repression that would reshape Europe. The moral question lingers. Where does adaptation end and complicity begin? In authoritarian systems, alignment is often rewarded before it is examined. Contracts arrive, orders expand, production scales. By the time consequences become visible, infrastructure is already in place. Hugo Boss was not alone. Across Germany, textile manufacturers, leather suppliers, button producers, dye companies, and insignia makers formed a network that sustained the visual machinery of the regime. Uniforms were not a niche product. They were a national priority. The black jacket worn at a rally began as raw cloth. It passed through hands, machines, quality checks, packaging lines. It traveled by rail to distribution centers. It was fitted, inspected, adjusted. It became power through process. The story of fashion and the SS is therefore not only about designers and symbols. It is about industry, about supply chains, about how modern business structures can function efficiently inside immoral systems. Factories do not ask who will wear the garment. They ask how many units are required. And in 1930s, Germany, the answer was millions. The image of authority was manufactured, not metaphorically, on a production line. Hugo Boss was not the only German company navigating the Third Reich. The story of fashion and the SS is not just about black uniforms. It is about how businesses adapted and profited inside a dictatorship. In the 1920s, in the small Bavarian town of Herzogenaurach, two brothers ran a shoe factory, Adolf and Rudolf Dassler. Their company, Gebruder Dassler Schuhfabrik, produced athletic footwear. It was not political. It was practical. But in 1933, everything changed. Adolf Adi Dassler joined the Nazi Party. So did his brother Rudolf. Membership was not unusual among business owners at the time. Party affiliation often meant smoother access to contracts, materials, and local influence. Their factory continued producing sports shoes, including those worn by German athletes at the 1936 Berlin Olympics. But when war began, civilian demand collapsed. The regime redirected industrial capacity toward military needs. The Dassler factory shifted production. Instead of sports footwear, it began manufacturing military boots and other equipment for the German armed forces. Like many factories across the Reich, it eventually used forced laborers as the war intensified, and German workers were drafted. After 1945, the brothers split. Adolf founded Adidas in 1949. Rudolf founded Puma the same year. Both brands would become global symbols of sport and innovation. But their wartime history remained part of their origin story. Neither Adidas nor Puma designed SS uniforms. They were not architects of Nazi aesthetics. They were manufacturers operating within a militarized economy. Yet their factories adapted to serve the regime's needs. This pattern extended far beyond footwear. German industry in the 1930s was not dismantled by the Nazis. It was integrated. The regime relied heavily on private enterprise. Companies that aligned with state priorities received contracts, raw materials, and protection. The economy was not purely state-run. It was coordinated capitalism, under authoritarian control. Businesses faced choices. Refusal was possible in theory, but risky. Compliance ensured survival, and often expansion. Military procurement created steady demand. War removed competitors. State-backed orders minimized uncertainty. Profit did not require ideological conviction. It required participation. The moral question is uncomfortable because it is not simple. Many industrialists were not fanatics. Some were opportunists. Others were pragmatic. Some were both. By the early 1940s, forced labor had become systemic across German industry. Millions of foreign civilians and prisoners of war worked in factories producing everything from weapons to textiles to footwear. Companies benefited from access to this labor pool under state direction. The business environment of the Third Reich blurred the boundary between coercion and advantage. When survival depends on alignment, is adaptation neutral? When contracts bring growth, is growth innocent? At what point does survival become complicity? The black SS uniform was a visible symbol of power. But beneath that symbol lay a web of contracts, supply chains, and factories. The regime's image was not sustained by ideology alone. It was sustained by commerce. The Third Reich demonstrated something modern and unsettling. Authoritarian systems do not eliminate markets. They redirect them. And when markets are redirected toward repression, businesses become part of the machinery, whether by conviction or calculation. The men who wore the uniforms stood at the front of history. The companies that supplied them stood behind it. But both were necessary for the image of power to endure. A uniform does not speak. But in Nazi Germany, it did not need to. By the mid-1930s, the SS uniform had moved beyond internal identity. It had become a visual instrument, staged, filmed, multiplied. The regime understood spectacle. The annual Nuremberg rallies were not spontaneous political gatherings. They were choreographed performances. Architect Albert Speer designed vast, symmetrical spaces that amplified scale. Columns aligned with light beams. Platforms elevated speakers above oceans of uniformed bodies. And in those formations, the black SS uniform played a central role. Black created contrast. Against pale stone, against searchlights piercing the night sky, against rows of brown SA shirts, the SS stood out. Their silhouettes were sharper, their presence more severe. Then came the camera. In 1935, filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl released Triumph of the Will, documenting the 1934 Nuremberg rally. The film did not invent Nazi ideology, but it refined its visual language. Riefenstahl used low camera angles to make uniformed figures appear taller. Long tracking shots emphasized synchronization. Close-ups isolated insignia, the skull, the runes, transforming them into symbols of authority. The uniform became cinematic architecture. In mass scenes, individual faces disappeared. What remained was pattern, repetition, order. Thousands of men dressed identically, moving identically, saluting identically. The effect was hypnotic. Discipline became visible. For a society emerging from economic collapse, political street violence, and years of instability, that image carried emotional weight. The uniform promised clarity. It suggested hierarchy in place of chaos. It projected certainty in a decade defined by uncertainty. Clothing became reassurance. The SS uniform did not simply distinguish its members. It constructed a narrative. Here stands an elite. Here stands control. Here stands a future that is organized. The visual message extended beyond rallies. Newspapers printed photographs of SS officers in immaculate dress. Propaganda posters emphasized sharp tailoring and polished boots. Youth organizations adopted standardized attire. Public ceremonies reinforced visual unity. Even ordinary civil servants were encouraged to present themselves in structured, regulated forms of dress. The regime saturated public space with uniformity. The result was psychological. Modern studies on crowd behavior suggest that synchronized visual signals increase perceptions of strength and legitimacy. When thousands appear identical and disciplined, opposition seems fragmented by comparison. The SS uniform amplified that effect. It created the impression of inevitability, and inevitability discourages resistance. The uniform also reframed violence. When authority is dressed in precision, actions appear procedural rather than personal. Orders seem institutional rather than individual. The black jacket and silver insignia transformed men into representatives of a system. In propaganda imagery, the SS rarely appeared disordered. They were photographed upright, composed, symmetrical. The aesthetic concealed the brutality behind it. Form masked function. By the time the SS oversaw policing, deportations, and camp administration, its image had already been normalized. The uniform no longer shocked. It signaled officialdom. Propaganda had done its work. The regime's mastery of visual presentation blurred the boundary between performance and power. Spectacle reinforced authority. Authority reinforced spectacle. The uniform became a brand, instantly recognizable, emotionally charged, globally broadcast. Fashion was not an accessory to dictatorship. It was marketing. Through film, photography, and ritualized display, the SS uniform sold an idea. That order had returned, that strength had replaced weakness, that discipline justified obedience. Millions saw that image. Many believed it. The black cloth did not create the ideology, but it packaged it, cleanly, efficiently, persuasively. And in politics, packaging can determine whether power looks temporary or permanent. The black uniform was designed to project control. By the early 1940s, it projected something else. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, the SS expanded rapidly. What had once been a selective elite organization became a vast apparatus of policing, intelligence, and racial policy. The same insignia that had gleamed under rally lights now appeared in occupied cities. Uniforms moved from parade grounds to railway platforms. SS officers supervised the sealing of ghettos in Warsaw, Łódź, and Krakow. They oversaw identification checks, curfews, confiscations of property. The black service uniform was often replaced in the field by gray or camouflage variants. But the insignia remained unmistakable. The runes, the skull, the collar tabs marking rank. Authority did not need introduction. As deportations intensified from 1941 onward, SS personnel coordinated transports. Jews were ordered from homes, assembled in squares, marched to trains. Photographs from occupied Europe show the same visual code repeated. Tailored coats, polished boots, rigid posture. The aesthetic of discipline now framed displacement. In January 1942, at the Wannsee Conference near Berlin, senior officials formalized what they termed the final solution to the Jewish question. The language was bureaucratic. The planning was administrative. The execution would be industrial. And the SS stood at its center. At extermination camps such as Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, and Sobibor, SS officers managed operations. Upon arrival, prisoners were separated, those deemed fit for forced labor, those sent directly to gas chambers. The uniform that had once symbolized elite belonging became inseparable from systematic murder. Survivor testimonies often describe details with unsettling clarity. The cut of the coat, the shine of insignia, the cold efficiency of orders delivered without raised voices. The uniform did not shout. It did not rage. It conveyed finality through composure. Elegance became intimidation. The visual contrast was stark. The SS officer appeared controlled, immaculate. The prisoners were exhausted, frightened, stripped of possessions and identity. The uniform accentuated hierarchy at its most extreme. Even within the camp system, clothing structured power. Prisoners wore striped garments, marked with colored triangles denoting classification. Guards wore precise insignia indicating rank. The visual order reinforced the system's logic. Everyone categorized, everyone placed. The same state that had invested so heavily in the aesthetic of discipline now applied discipline to extermination. It is tempting to separate image from action, to view the uniform as surface and the crime as substance. But the two were intertwined. The uniform did not merely accompany violence. It stabilized it. It gave it administrative form. Mass murder was conducted through paperwork, timetables, quotas, and through men dressed to represent authority. The black uniform that had once drawn admiration in 1934, Berlin became, by 1943, a symbol recognized across Europe with fear. In occupied territories, the sight of SS insignia signaled arrest, deportation, reprisal. The brand had changed meaning. No longer elite, no longer modern, no longer ceremonial. It became synonymous with terror. By the end of the war, approximately 6 million Jews had been murdered, alongside millions of others, targeted by Nazi racial and political policies. The SS organization played a central role in that system. When Allied forces liberated camps in 1945, they encountered evidence of industrialized killing. Gas chambers, crematoria, warehouses filled with confiscated belongings. Among the remnants were uniforms abandoned in retreat, symbols stripped of authority but not of memory. The cut was still precise, the fabric still dark, but the illusion had collapsed. The same black cloth that once projected order now embodied atrocity. The silver insignia that had flashed under searchlights became evidence in war crimes trials. The transformation was complete. From elegance to extermination, the uniform had not changed. Its function had. In May 1945, the Third Reich collapsed. Uniforms that had symbolized permanence were discarded, burned, hidden in basements. The insignia of the Schutzstaffel were outlawed. The men who wore them were arrested, interrogated, or vanished into post-war anonymity. But what about the factories? Allied authorities launched denazification processes across occupied Germany. Major war criminals stood trial in Nuremberg. High-ranking SS leaders were prosecuted, many executed or imprisoned. The organization itself was declared criminal. Industrialists were also investigated, especially those tied to armaments, chemicals, and forced labor. Some executives faced trial. Others were classified into categories ranging from major offender to follower. Hugo Ferdinand Boss was processed under this system. In 1946, he was classified as a Mitläufer, a follower. He was fined and temporarily barred from running his company. The penalty was financial and administrative. It was not imprisonment. He died in 1948, 3 years after the war ended. The company survived him. Throughout the 1950s, as West Germany rebuilt its economy during the Wirtschaftswunder, Hugo Boss repositioned itself. The firm shifted away from uniforms and toward men's tailoring. By the 1970s and 1980s, the brand cultivated a new identity: sharp suits, corporate elegance, international expansion. The black uniform of the SS was not part of its advertising. For decades, many German companies maintained minimal public discussion of their wartime roles. The broader focus of post-war Germany was reconstruction and political stabilization. Confronting industrial complicity was gradual and uneven. That began to change in the late 20th century. In the 1990s, renewed historical research and public pressure pushed corporations to examine their archives. Lawsuits in the United States and Europe raised questions about forced labor during the war. German industry responded collectively. In 2000, The German government and several major companies established the foundation Remembrance, Responsibility, and Future, Erinnerung, Verantwortung und Zukunft. The fund provided compensation to former forced laborers. Hugo Boss participated in this initiative. In 2011, the company issued a public statement expressing profound regret for its role during the Nazi period, including the use of forced labor and its production of uniforms for the regime. The language was careful. It acknowledged history without sensationalism. Other companies with wartime connections followed similar paths. Research commissions were commissioned. Independent historians were granted access to archives. Public apologies were issued. Memorial funding was provided. Yet the tension remains. Modern consumers encounter brands in storefronts and digital campaigns. Logos are associated with performance, luxury, or innovation. The historical layers beneath them are rarely visible at first glance. Adidas and Puma, both founded after the war by the Dassler brothers, have acknowledged that their predecessor factory operated under the Nazi regime and used forced labor. Both companies have supported historical research into their wartime records. Today, their branding emphasizes global sport and inclusivity. Volkswagen, Siemens, BMW. Many German firms with documented involvement in wartime production have funded memorial initiatives and historical transparency projects. The question is not whether these companies exist today. They do. The question is how memory functions within capitalism. Can a brand outlive its moral stain? History suggests that it can, but not unchanged. Corporate survival often depends on adaptation. Logos evolve. Leadership changes, markets expand, generations pass. The individuals responsible for wartime decisions die. Ownership structures shift. But documentation persists. Archives remain. Survivor testimonies endure. Court records exist. The relationship between brand identity and historical responsibility is not static. It must be managed through acknowledgement, education, and, in some cases, compensation. For some observers, apologies decades later feel insufficient. For others, transparency represents meaningful progress. What is clear is this: the aesthetic success of the SS uniform did not vanish in 1945. It transformed into a cautionary example of how design and industry can be mobilized by authoritarian power. The companies that manufactured those uniforms operate today in a different political environment, one shaped, in part, by the lessons of that era. Memory does not dissolve with rebranding. It becomes part of the brand's history. And perhaps that is the final irony. The black uniform once symbolized authority without question. Today, the companies linked to its production operate in markets where questions are constant. History does not prevent reinvention, but it ensures that reinvention carries a record. After 1945, the aesthetic of the SS became untouchable. The black uniform, the skull insignia, the rigid tailoring, all of it was legally restricted in Germany and morally radioactive across Europe. The Schutzstaffel had been declared a criminal organization at the Nuremberg trials. Its symbols were banned. Its image was inseparable from genocide. For decades, no serious designer would have publicly referenced it. And yet, aesthetics rarely disappear. They mutate. By the late 1960s and 1970s, Western fashion began rediscovering militarism, not as ideology, but as style. Structured shoulders, long coats, high boots, severe tailoring, black leather, metal hardware. The visual language of authority re-entered the runway, stripped of explicit political insignia. The context was different. Post-war Europe was confronting authority, questioning institutions, and experimenting with provocation. Youth subcultures, punk, post-punk, industrial, adopted military silhouettes precisely because they were charged. Uniforms were deconstructed, exaggerated, sexualized. Designers like Jean-Paul Gaultier in the 1980s played with structured, authoritarian shapes, corsetry, rigid lines, fetish-coated uniforms. Not Nazi uniforms, but echoes of severity, of control, of power aesthetics. The term Nazi chic began appearing in media commentary, often controversially, to describe fashion and pop culture that borrowed from totalitarian visual codes without referencing ideology directly. At the same time, underground fetish culture amplified similar elements. Black leather coats, polished boots, peaked caps, strict silhouettes. The aesthetic language overlapped with historical uniforms, though the intent was different: sexual provocation rather than political propaganda. This raised uncomfortable questions. Could a silhouette be neutral? Was a long black leather coat simply a garment? Or did it carry historical memory? In cinema, the visual power of Nazi uniforms was also reused. Directors repeatedly depicted SS officers as sharply dressed villains. The imagery was dramatic, instantly recognizable. The aesthetic of menace had commercial value, but commercialization risked normalization. In the 1990s and 2000s, several fashion controversies reignited debate. Runway collections featuring stark militarism, heavy boots, armbands, or severe black tailoring were occasionally criticized for evoking fascist imagery. Even when no direct symbols were used, the visual parallels triggered discomfort. Designers generally denied ideological intent. Most insisted they were exploring themes of authority, discipline, or historical reference without endorsing the politics behind them. And in many cases, that was true. Fashion constantly recycles power symbols. Military coats from Napoleonic armies, trench coats from World War I, bomber jackets from World War II. Context shifts. Meaning evolves. Yet the SS uniform occupies a different category. It was not simply military attire. It was part of an apparatus of genocide. This is what makes the aesthetic uniquely volatile. Black leather and structured tailoring are not inherently fascist. But history attaches weight to certain combinations of cut, color, and posture. The sharpness that once projected discipline can also evoke domination. The polished boot can signal authority or repression. The debate around Nazi chic is therefore less about individual designers and more about cultural memory. Can aesthetics be separated from ideology? In theory, yes. A garment does not contain politics in its fibers. Meaning is assigned by context. In practice, it is more complicated. Visual codes carry associations. The SS invested heavily in constructing an image of elite authority. That image proved powerful. Powerful enough that decades later, fragments of it still resonate in fashion, film, and subculture. When designers borrow from militarism, they tap into a visual grammar shaped partly by history. Sometimes consciously, sometimes indirectly. The question is not whether fashion should explore power aesthetics. It always has. The question is whether history can be removed from the silhouette. In the end, the black uniform remains a reminder. Style is never entirely innocent. It can elevate, it can seduce, it can intimidate, and once it helped make authority look inevitable.